Before precision ag was a thing, Wade Barnes was just a young agronomist in Manitoba, testing ideas most folks thought were crazy. GPS, satellite imagery, back then it was frontier science. But he saw something others didn't. Yields went up, fertilizer costs dropped, and before long that small-town experiment turned into farmer's edge, changing the way farming's done around the world.
I would say that the agronomy piece was just starting to get going, that not a lot of retails had agronomists. There was sort of well-established retails like, and this is a name from the past, but like Team Landmark, which was doing agronomy as a paid-for service, which was almost unheard of, spent the first year there. My local co-op back home at Twin Valley in Bertle had hired one of the first agronomists in the co-op system, a guy by the name of Miles Williamson. They had moved him to Minneota Co-op, and they were looking for an agronomist in Bertle, local boy. So I got to work the summer there, and as an agronomist at the Twin Valley Co-op at the time, nobody really knew what the hell you were supposed to do. And I hung off of Miles's apron string as he kind of taught me agronomy, and learned a lot that first year. Went back to school, finished the final year, and then got a full-time job back at the Twin Valley Co-op. An interesting thing happened that kind of sort of changed my life, I would say, is that as I worked that first summer, there was a guy that had moved back into town by the name of Dalton, and he started a GIS store, and he was sort of talking about how to use Garmin devices and log GPS points, and that's what Art had done in the government. And then he ended up talking some local farmers into doing a precision ag project and getting yield monitors. And so there was 3 or 4 guys, well-to-do farmers in our area, guys like Garth Butcher and George Wadey and Ron Bell, that essentially went down and started a precision ag project. The University of Manitoba got involved, Wesco Fertilizers, and I was just a kid that was sort of involved in it. And they the co-op had built kind of probably the first GPS tower, I think, in Western Canada, in order to get a GPS correction so these guys could log yield data. And
this was around maybe 2000-ish?
No, it was before then. It was kind of like 98, 99. Mm-hmm. So super fascinating stuff. From there, I moved on and ended up getting a job at the Swan River Co-op, which was sort of the, that's what everybody aspired to go to, was Swan River, because that was the biggest co-op in the area. So I went up there for a while, and then ended up getting a job opportunity with United Grain Growers at Roblin, at their distribution center. And I was to kind of try to build a business kind of out of the Roblin area. And then they moved me from Roblin to Gilbert Plains, and I was sort of getting and then they were already kind of making plans to send me back to Shoal Lake, and because they were just building that terminal, and I was sort of getting a little bit edgy around, like, holy crap, everybody just keeps bouncing me and moving me, and then an opportunity showed up at Double Diamond Farm Supply in Pilot Mound. They had just acquired the assets from the old Snowflake Farm Supplies. And it was a chance to go and be the manager and kind of run my own show. And, I was pretty young. I was probably 22 at the time, and so I got there, and there wasn't much of a facility. There was like a chem shed and an anhydrous tank, an old anhydrous shack. And that was my office. And in the mornings, I'd have to fight the mice off to, in order to get my spot in the one room with all the anhydrous hoses. And, so it was a cool experience. They ended up building a new office there, and I spent a fair amount of time, in that community, And then the precision ag piece sort of showed up again, and I had that background. I went to a meeting down in the US. And so, Pilot Mound, not that far away from the sugar beet industry in the US. So if you go to a meeting in Grand Forks, you're kind of in the sugar beet industry. And, I saw what they were doing with satellite imagery and how they were using that to kind of create sort of zones and fields. And, they were using, rather than a grid, they were kind of using kind of this production zones that were like really essentially like soils maps. And it was like, wow, that works. That's completely what we were missing before. So I had all this kind of knowledge from before, and knew that kind of the things that we were doing in that first precision project, it didn't really work that well. With seeing how satellite imagery kind of changed everything. So I kind of came back, and there was another guy that I worked with by the name of Curtis McKinnon, who was super bright when it came to anything technology wise. I had this idea. I said, hey, is there a way that we could get our old Laurel floater to be able to do variable rate? And, we can use this satellite imagery and all this stuff. And so we kind of went to work to figure this out. We dabbled with a Varus machine at the very early stages of that. There was one that I think the old Rambach had, and we used it, and we used satellite imagery. We sourced and found a satellite imagery provider in the US called SatShot. And in the end, we kind of decided that the Varus machine was sort of showing us all the same stuff that the satellite was showing us, but we liked the satellite better because the satellite was showing us not just call it the natural variability, which what Varus would show us, but it was showing us this man-made stuff, like these old fence lines and pastures that were from like 30, 40 years ago that were still showing up in kind of, difference in vegetation areas of the field. So it was super cool. It was mind-blowing. So Curtis went to work to figure out how to get the old Laurel floater set up to do variable rate. We kind of did our first project, I think, with about 1,200 acres with 2, 3, 4 farmers in the area, and we saw something super cool. We saw yields go up and fertilizer rates kind of go down. And how could that be? That was sort of counterintuitive to any type of agronomy. But we realized that there was areas of the field that were naturally high in organic matter, and were naturally higher in nitrogen versus other parts of the field. And though that seems so elementary now, it wasn't at that time, right? Like, I would say that, Manitoba agriculture, really any soil fertility work that had been done, nobody had ever broke a field up, by soil types and sampled it separately to understand the real differences. And, especially in areas of good soil where, there wasn't, if you get to by Bertle, there's hilltops and sandy areas and sloughs but in Pilot Mound, some of that land's, big wide open fields, not that much difference. But when you actually saw it on a satellite and you would start to soil sample, you go, wow, that is different. And really what we realized that, there could be a third of the field if the farmer put too much nitrogen, it would lodge. Well, why only a third? Well, that part of the field had higher organic matter, would release more nitrogen through the season, and so the farmers would generally hold back on their fertilizer, worrying about that third of the field that would lodge. Well, we kind of came up with this concept of saying, hey, like, why don't we just pull the fertilizer back on those areas and push more on these other areas? And that's what sort of increased the yield. So we kind of learned as we went, and everybody said we were wrong. Like, why, and there was a lot of academics that had been working on this for a long, long time. And suddenly now these kids show up and have a totally different philosophy, and we kind of piss some people off, I think, at times. Now, it was kind of interesting. I would say at the time, it became so cool, and the farmers got so engaged around it in Pilot Mound